My pleasure to introduce our plenary speaker now. This has been a bit of a, this is a neat cultural exchange. One of the things I'm told about the British culture, the English culture, is I was told there are no serious introductions. And they said something about taking the piss out of every English speaker. So I asked Graham, I said, so, you're a Brit and I'm supposed to take the piss. What exactly should I be saying about it? He said, you don't need to do that for me. He says, I'm good. So I'll just give you what's here. So Dr. Tipple is a chartered town planner and independent consultant. He has over 40 years experience in research and teaching on housing and urban development in Africa and Asia, including writing many major documents for UN Habitat. He is joint author with Suzanne Speak of The Missing Millions, Homelessness in Developing Countries. And he is currently writing the housing chapter of the forthcoming World Cities Report in 2015, and is part of a group developing the global housing strategy beginning in 2016. Dr. Tipple.
I did a thing that no speaker should do, certainly no preacher should do. I'm a preacher in the Methodist Church. And the one thing we're told when we train is never change your mind at the last minute. Never change what you're going to preach on. Well, I have. Because sitting up at the back there yesterday, there were things that came up which seemed to be better to address than what I was meant to address. I have done a PowerPoint for what I was meant to address, and I will leave it. So, if you want to look at that PowerPoint about how developing countries differ from developed countries and so on, it is going to be available. Thank you very much indeed. So do I have to do that? I can do that. Yeah, I can do that. I'm a lecturer, I can do this. But because I'm over 15, I do it with my finger and not with my thumb. So, and what we've just heard sort of is a good lead-in for what I've decided to do. All that will happen is it won't be as fluent as the other one would have been. So please forgive me if I have to sort of remind myself where I am in the place. It's now 9:30. Okay, so I've got to about 10 to 10. Okay. My 20 minutes. Good. Homelessness in developing countries. Great title. Enormous title. And what I'm going to talk about comes from two main sources, but it's a very housing-oriented approach. I didn't come into homelessness research out of any altruistic motive about the poor. I came to homelessness research out of the need to be able to define the housing stock. What do you include in the housing stock and what do you exclude from the housing stock? Because that's what I do. I do national and city level housing policy. So we got I got some money from DFID, and we had 9 consultants in 9 developing countries, and one in another country that let us down. So we have 9 countries in the hidden millions, homeless in developing countries. If you buy the hardback, it's blue, but the softbacks are sort of peely white grey colour. I think that must be one of about 2 hardback copies. You don't make any money selling, writing these things. We're still in debt for the index. It also comes out of recent consultancy experience. I retired from the university very early, in 2010. And since then I've been doing consultancy. I promised myself that I wouldn't bid for consultancy, but I would do it if they asked me. And I've been really very busy. And I've had experience in 7 African countries in the last 5 years, on the top of 35 years experience in Africa, living in 2 African countries, visiting 23, and so on. I mean, I'm an Africanist. And I've been working in 7 countries in the last 5 years, and I've written housing sector profiles, which are on the UN Habitat website, for Malawi, Zambia, Ghana, Liberia, and Lesotho. And I've also done some work for the World Bank in Ethiopia, and I did some work for Comic Relief in Sierra Leone. And in all those 7 countries, we've been asking people much the same questions and looking at much the same issues on housing. And those are the 2 sources I come to you with. I'm a researcher and a policies advisor I'm not a hands-on person. It's up to you, people, to take our research and do something with it that actually affects real people. And unless that happens, my living has been in vain. Okay? So what's homelessness? Squatters invaded this hillside in Lima, and they built to differing standards. Are any of these so poorly housed as to be homeless? That's a question I have to grapple with when I calculate housing stock for a city. Are these people homeless? The guy on the left sleeps on the basket that he uses to make a living in the market in Bangladesh. And are these homeless? These people have social life. They are not divorced from society. Are they homeless, living on the street in Delhi? And how about these living in Dharavi in Mumbai? I wouldn't live there. I wouldn't spend a night there. I'd walk through it, sort of voyeuristically, which I've done in lots of places. What about these people in Delhi? People who live in there. It looks as though they have animals, they've got a cart. Are they homeless? Or these who live in Bhumiheen camp in Delhi and have home-based enterprises. That's another piece of work we've done. And how about these who live on the roof of dwellings in Old Cairo? And these who live in Addis Ababa. It's not even the standard building material, which I've just forgotten what it's called. It's just tin and sticks. And how about the renters in this tin house on the beach in New Crew Town, Monrovia? And these people who built in mud brick in Malawi. And again, mud brick in Kitwe, Zambia, a city I lived in for 3 years. And this lady who lives in Masvingo on the edge of Nairobi. We have a human right to housing. I think it's a serious mistake as a policy person. I think it's a serious mistake, the right to housing, but I can argue that with you. Under human rights and under the International Covenant of Economic and Social Cultural Rights of 1966, states recognise the right of everyone to adequate standard of living, including adequate food, clothing and housing, and to continuous improvement of living conditions. The states parties will take appropriate steps to ensure the realisation of this right. Okay? That is nearly 50 years old. What's happening? We use the word adequate in the excellent document that we've been given, trying to make sense of global homelessness, and the definition uses the word adequate. I would argue that this is not helpful, because UN Habitat define adequate housing, and it's defined by several measures. Tenure security, and all of those people that you've already seen have no tenure security except the Malawians. Structural stability. Well, again, you know, does it have to be completely structurally stable, which is what the adequacy talks about? Infrastructure is meant to be there. All three services, water, sanitation, and power. They're meant to have some sort of solid waste disposal. But thousands of people in cities across the world, millions of people live without all or some of those services. Even the rich. Convenient access to employment and community services. What is convenient? And also occupancy. And it sets a limit of 3 persons per room. Now, if you put 3 persons per room into your house, just do it now, into the dwelling you live in, put 3 persons into the rooms. Good grief. You know? And you'd think, yeah, that's overcrowding. Ghanaians don't think it's overcrowding. The mean, that's the average occupancy rate in Kumasi, Ghana, where I lived for 4 years, the average occupancy rate is 3.3 people per room. And they live like that, they have coping strategies, it's fine. So why would a person not have adequate housing if they fell down below that? So, I think we have to be very careful about using this word adequacy. The right to adequate housing has caused all sorts of issues to arise all over the world. The South Africans were the first people to put it into their constitution because they were doing a constitution about that time. And then they've had some case law which has helped us to define what the right of adequate housing means, because it doesn't mean that government should provide housing for everybody. And this lady called Grootboom, Mrs. Grootboom, and her neighbours in a part of Greater Cape Town took the local authority to court because they had been moved out of their squatter settlement, and they'd been moved onto a playing field of a school, and they thought that their housing rights had been breached. And it went all the way through case law, all the way to the Constitutional Court. And the Constitutional Court determined, and this has gone into international ideas, that a government has two duties with respect to the housing rights of its people within its housing policy. And one, it's got to have a housing policy in place that over time will house everybody. Now you think that's not much good to Mrs. Grootboom. But it also said it needs to provide for at least a substantial proportion of emergency and crisis needs with basic housing and services. That is where IGH might be able to have some leverage, in there. Because if a government can say, hey, we've got a housing policy, come on, give us a chance, you'd have to turn away with your head in your hands and go away. But this second one is somewhere where you can push that might give. It may be, however, more appropriate to deal with homelessness through the rights to services, the rights of the child to be serviced and so on. I don't know that that's the case, but it could be, and it's worth looking at. The nature of homelessness in developed countries and developing countries is very different. In developing countries, homelessness is generally a result of lack of housing and a failure of the market housing supply. And homeless people need an alternative to market housing. They need access to secure land title, and that doesn't necessarily mean freehold. Too much security is not a good thing for the poor in Africa and Asia, because somebody who has less security and is richer just comes along with a suitcase full of money, more than they've ever seen in their lives, but nowhere near the value of the land, and they sell out and move on. It's called raiding in our field. But they need some security of land title, even if it's only perceived. They need some sort of demand-side subsidies to increase their ability to afford housing, and they usually need less than a whole dwelling. All the housing policies I've ever come across, and certainly in these 7 African countries, are aimed only at people living in fully serviced, self-contained, single household dwellings. There's no housing policy towards building compounds, helping people to add rooms to their house for rental, and so on. And homeless people often need much less than a dwelling. The causes, 2 fundamental causes in developing countries: poverty, especially rural poverty, and the failure of the housing supply. But poverty and housing shortage alone don't necessarily lead to homelessness. For instance, in Malawi, there is no shortage of housing. Malawi is a basket case in terms of its indicators. But hey, there's no shortage of housing. Whereas in Ghana, which is a much wealthier nation, there's a gigantic shortage of housing. And the reason is that anybody in Malawi can still build a house in the city with the ground that it stands on and a few sticks. And they're not allowed to in other countries. But rural to urban migration makes things worse, but we can't turn it round. It won't happen. People come to cities. The Bible starts with a garden, but it ends with a city. Cities are not bad news. They're just badly managed. They're much more economically and every other way productive than any other part of the country. So let's not try and push people back to the rural areas. They've been doing it for 60 years, it doesn't work. It's like putting money into a black hole, some of the rural government. We've got social causes, of course. You know, another boyfriend moves into the house and the teenage girl thinks, hey, I'm not staying around here. And off she goes. Or the little boy starts getting beaten by his new stepfather and he moves out onto the street. So there are social causes. There's political unrest, obviously lots of people moving around in the Middle East and in some parts of Africa. Evictions. We've got to stop evictions, folks. We really have to stop them. That doesn't mean that a landlord shouldn't be able to get rid of somebody in their property that's not paying the rent. That means that we shouldn't be clearing land of poor people to make way for a shopping mall, which we are doing. and unhelpful housing policies for the majority. What do I mean by that? Here's an income pyramid for Nigeria. Sorry, it's a bit fuzzy. It was much tinier than that in the book. And the people here are on less than $1.25 a day, $1.25 to $2. Look how high up the income scale that comes on less than $2 a day. That's 80%. And they're the low income. And then you've got the middle income in the green on $2 to $4, and then above $4. And all of these people have no supply in the formal sector. And sometimes countries even call them the homeless. And because they, in their sloppy way, call people right up there homeless and low income, policy up there, which is so much easier than lower down, can tick the boxes for low-income household, slum dwellers. People up there do, they live in slums. I hate the word, but we were told in the early part of the century we had to use it because it was sexy. But most of us in the field hate the word. They can still live in slums, those people. And so to help them right up there is so easy that that's where governments do it. And that's my experience in the last 5 years. The global strategy for shelter is over. It used an enabling approach which said that governments don't build, instead they enable the most appropriate actors, if it's a household or a building contractor or whoever, infrastructure agency, to provide the 6 inputs to housing, 5 of which are markets: land, finance, infrastructure, construction industry and building material, and the 6th is the regulatory framework. That's the laws and the city council and so on. And government's reaction to that was, hey, great, we don't have to build housing anymore, and they just left it alone. And they expected markets to do everything. They also classify far too many people as low income. You know, we get low income, medium income, high income. You think, oh, a third, a third, a third. Or 40%, 30%, 30%. Not at all. 85% low, 10% medium, 5% high, or something like that. And so only the richest, 20 to 40%, are helped. Everybody I've talked to in senior levels in government in those 7 countries have tended to use the same expression about the cost of housing, or what affordable housing is. They say a newly graduated civil servant cannot afford a 2-bedroom apartment. A newly graduated civil servant, they're way up the income scale. They're almost at the top already, and if that's what affordable housing is, then they're not helping nearly everybody else. And when I ask them about them, they say, oh, no, we don't do anything on that. GSS is being superseded by the Global Housing Strategy in 2016, and the MDGs are being superseded by the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, you have a possibility to make an input to the Global Housing Strategy before and at Habitat 3 in Ecuador. If you bother to go, and if you get involved with trying to help things. At the moment, I'm writing the housing chapter for the global report, which feeds into Habitat 3. Okay? It's the only chapter on housing, and I'm writing it. Okay? So if anybody's got a paragraph that they'd like to write about homelessness, then I can sneak in. We're going to have an expert general meeting in New York at the end of this month of the people who are writing the various chapters, infrastructure, transport, whatever else. Okay? Now, if you can give me some input, I can try and persuade Ben Arima from UN Habitat, who is my client, that I'll put something in on homelessness. If not in the housing chapter, then in the conclusions chapter. And at the moment, my chapter says that GHS must address the bottom 25% of the population through some sort of subsidised housing. And it may be demand-side subsidies, like making people a bit richer so they can afford housing, which is the proper way of subsidising, or it might be supply-side, building housing specially targeted for them, because that's easier, because houses don't move about. You know, they're easily recognised, but it's much less efficient and much more difficult to target. The GHS will probably include welfare housing. I've already seen drafts of it, and it will probably include it. But it needs accurate targeting. One of the first things I was given when I started work on homelessness, which there's a thing, UN Habitat Strategies to Combat Homelessness, which I wrote, and it was published in 2000. When they gave me that job, they provided me with a draft by Springer, who was a researcher, an intern, I think, there. And she had done this diagram with, the whole thing's inadequate shelter, but these are people who are in some sort of housing, at risk or concealed, or just in substandard housing. And there is a gap to the people who are sleeping rough and in public shelters, and there's mobility. Having done the work in our 9 countries, we decided that we should redo this, and it's all in the same box, or the no box, and we've got poor policy here, where people can fall down from homelessness into what I would call homelessness, certainly street homelessness, through poor policy, and they can get their way back up through various flimsy shelters. Now, the validity of that will come clear, I hope. What's needed to help homeless people? Well, we need a culture of care and support rather than indifference and victim blaming. I was astonished how few people in the countries I've visited have any care at all for the poor when they're in government. Government treats people like itself. Government deals with people like itself. It doesn't go down the income scale. It really doesn't. And I'm shocked to the core about that. Because the first thing we learned in planning school in 1967 is planning is for people. Forget it, folks. Planning is for the minister and keep him happy. But we really need to look back and get into a pro-poor state of mind. What's needed? At the level of rough sleeping, some of the measures that would help include legalising street sleeping. It's illegal in too many countries, or certainly was when we wrote the book, and the really stringent penalties for sleeping on the streets. It's got to be legalised. And there must be an end to abuse of homeless people by authorities. Maybe we need an easily accessible free shelter, or almost free shelter. We need public services, water points, sanitation points. We need to have security lockers, because homeless people in developing countries have paraphernalia. They've got rickshaws or telecarts or stock that they need to be able to store overnight. They're not people who just have what they stand up in. We need safe refuge for abused women and children, and we need free accessible health, medical and legal support. Most rough sleepers only get access to private medicine because the public hospitals won't take them because they smell. At the level of mass homelessness, we need more housing, especially the sort that the poorest houses can afford and tend to live in, which is shared and rented. Housing should be cheap. It should be built in labour-intensive technologies, because that is enormously economically successful. It provides loads of work, both in construction and in other sectors of the economy. And also, construction is self-selecting to the poor. If you're not poor, you're not a building labourer. So if you can increase construction, you can help the economy. If only David Cameron knew that. It should be situated close to sources of work. It's no good moving somebody who starts pushing a rickshaw when the night guy hands it over to him at 5 in the morning, and then he starts in the centre of Delhi. It's no good asking for him to live in Jahangir Puri, out on the outskirts, and get a trade in. That's not the point. He needs to be in the centre of the city for his work, and he needs to be there early morning. And it should be serviced to a minimum level to keep costs down. For those with rudimentary structures, some security of tenure is important, just as long as they know they're not going to be a victim. That's all they need. They don't need all the other bits, all other bundles of security of tenure. And so they can develop their house in the future. I think it's very important, and we may need to put it in our definition in some way. An upward trajectory might be a definitional issue. If somebody is living in a place where they have the ability to improve, then they might not be regarded as homeless. This is something I was learned in discussions with Sheila Patel, who heads up Slum Dwellers International. If people can improve where they are, then maybe they're not homeless. We don't need a full security title, but just some rights to occupy and to service. And if you have been, thank you for listening.
Okay, I think we've got time for a couple of questions before we break for the next sessions. And it will have to be a couple because we're running a bit late. Any questions for Graham on that really enthralling run through there, which is, I think, fascinating. Any questions? Question at the back there.
Yes. Could you talk about subsidies for home ownership as opposed to rental? In developed countries, the ability to deduct mortgage interest from one's taxes actually fosters ownership, but then actually often impedes the development of the low-cost rental market. Does that apply in developing countries?
Very, very few developing countries have direct tax relief and things for home ownership. But what they nearly all do, they nearly all have this thing that they call affordable housing, some sort of policy. The Chinese have it, and everybody else have got this idea that there's affordable housing coming in, and it's subsidised. Even if it's not outwardly subsidised, it's built on free government land, nobody has to pay for the architect, the services are provided free or low cost, and sometimes loans are from a special finance circuit which is at low income scale. One of the archetypes of this, and I hope Jemba doesn't mind me sharing this, is Ethiopia. There's the IHDP, the Integrated Housing Development Programme in Ethiopia, builds 5-storey condominiums and up to 13-storey condominiums as affordable housing. And it's not affordable to 65% of the population. And it's hugely subsidised. I was talking to a man in Addis earlier in the year about it, and he worked in the place when they started doing it. And I said to him, okay, so how much is the subsidy on IHDP? And he said, I'm not allowed to say. And I said, so if I said it was a half, would you quibble with that? He said, I'm not allowed to say. It's impossible to know. So even the small amount of money that's devoted to housing in some countries, and boy, it's small in many countries. You know, there are countries that are poorer than you would imagine. And they have this tiny housing budget, and it tends to go on affordable, low income housing. It gets right to the top of the income scale, and it's subsidised through and through.
Thank you. One more question, or are we ready to break? One question here.
Hi, have you seen any type of loans where persons who qualify for housing need not pay their loans back straight away? Because you may have people in situations where they might not even be able to afford paying the repayment of the loan within the first month, no matter how small the amounts may be. Have you seen anything that's been basically put off, to say a few months or a year?
I haven't come across them. There are all sorts of what the bankers call financial products. How are they products? Anyway, where you get holidays from paying, but you usually have to pay towards the end a bit more. And there are some loans in which the repayments go up over time, assuming that people get wealthier, or maybe that inflation takes it away. There are those loans. But again, they nearly always only go to the top few percent of the population. Often, you've got to apply in writing, so that's a whole load of the population out in the first place. Usually there's a big deposit, and that's what kills it. Big deposit in IHDP is 20% of the whole value, which although that's only $2,000, hey, there aren't very many people in Ethiopia who can gather $2,000, So those are the sort of things. I think home ownership is a very overblown way of providing housing. Yes, everybody wants to own their own home. Of course they do. But pushing home ownership is a bit like having a transport policy that says only a Rolls Royce is allowed on the road. I've got a Citroen and it's 10 years old and it's fine. Hey, And this idea that we've got to push home ownership. Renting is an enormously important tenure. Renting is not failed ownership. It isn't. And in some countries that we would all admire, they have extraordinarily low home ownership rates. Germany, Switzerland, really low home ownership rates. Hey, it's the American and the British systems that have pushed it. Oh, and of course, we Africans, we want to own our own house before we die. Yeah, fine. But not everybody can. And we've got to put housing in at the lowest level in the market, and you don't do it by home ownership. What you can do it by is Housing microfinance. If you can get the microfinancial organisation to get into housing, which is quite difficult because they borrow short and then they would have to lend long, which is the perennial problem with mortgages. But loans of a couple of $1,000s over 2 years, if they were easily available, you could completely transform the housing stock. But who wants to handle $2,000? Banks don't. It's too much transaction cost. So it would have to be housing finance through NGOs and so on. That could work and put more housing goods into the bottom of the market, like extended rooms. Put another room on your house, rent it out to a renter, helps you to afford the house, gives you a pension in the future, and it puts housing in at the lowest level of the stock. So the normal developed country solutions to housing usually don't work in developing countries. We have a completely different literature, those of us who work in developing countries, from those housing specialists. I mean, I work with Rose Gilroy, who's, some of you who are in housing will know the name, Rose Gilroy. She works in Britain and on Britain. She hasn't read any of the stuff I've read, and I haven't read any of the stuff she's read, because developing countries are different.
Graham, thank you very much. Another round of applause, please.